To sit down. I know the greater challenge would be to stop talking, but is very Galer Armadin agus Falter Roy and Shachig Scott Harigi Conal Govila is a ladiog. Maradarim Gachli and Kurim Falter Roy Shudaton Shudon Headwer. Agus Kurimid Falter Roy Shudavi and Shanirig. Agus Sasuligam coming in Gahena, Tahanav, Agus Sarsav Asan Glor. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Murray Sprick. I'm the director of the summer school, and I'd like to welcome you to this 7th annual Daniel O'Connell Summer School. For those of you who were here before, you'll know that the recipe for this programme really hasn't changed very much. That's not because we don't have any imagination, but because it seems to work. And as you know, the programme consists of a series of short 20-minute lectures on various aspects of the history of South Kerry and so forth. And we do keep to our timetable, said I, speaking 10 minutes late, but we do try and keep to our programme, or to our timetable. And then after each session, we'll have a question and answer session for those of you who want to put questions to our panel. There are 2 slight changes to the programme this year. Again, for those of you who were here before, you'll know that we always have a special event down in the GA field down at St Mary's, the Conkeaty Memorial Park, where we always look forward to hearing from one of the greats of Kerry football, and we have a lot of them for those of you who come from outside the country. Well, we may need it, but we're humble about this. But in any event, that wasn't possible to organise this year. But what we are doing at 7 o'clock this evening is having a mass down in the Penal Church in Carsavine. Again, it has surprised me, and in one way it has, and in another way it hasn't, that many people, even in the town, were unaware of the existence of this Penal Church. It's at the entrance to the car park. And for those of you who want to come to that mass, which will be on at 7 o'clock this evening, please access it from O'Connell Street, from where the new hotel is, the Skellig Star Hotel. Go down that way, because the other entrance will be blocked off. But that's at 7 o'clock, and I think that whether you're religious or not, I think it's fair to say that this particular event is an important event in the history of the parish and in the history of the town. For those of you who want to come, you should be advised that seating is very limited. It's a very old building, goes back over 200 years, so there's seating for only about 70 people, I think. Otherwise, in the time-honoured tradition of attending Mass in Ireland, you could stand at the back, or even outside the back, or even outside the back door. But this is just to forewarn those of you who want to get a seat to be there early. Now, the second change to our programme concerns the Daniel O'Connell lecture. This year it will be given in the format of an interview. Again, this is something we did when Micheál Martin was here last year and when Mary McAleese was here 3 years ago. And again, it worked very well. And there will be opportunities for questions after Stephen Collins has finished his interview with Seamus Mallon. We're very honoured, as I'll say this afternoon again, to have Seamus here. But we're adding something to it this year. We're inaugurating the Daniel O'Connell Award, and we're very honoured that Seamus has agreed to become the first recipient of that. And we will be presenting that to him after his interview, about 4:15, thereabouts. And after that, Micheál Lyne's book in Tilana, some of you may have seen this, which is a collection of essays by Micheál, one of the great local historians of this district, that will be launched in the room next door. So that's really all I have to say. There's one other housekeeping thing I should say, I suppose, and that is again to remind you that the library will close at 1 o'clock, will reopen at 2:15 for the Mallon interview. So those of you who want to attend the Mallon interview, just be aware that seating again is on a first come, first served basis. So don't be cute and leave your clothes or your coats on the seats, because they'll be removed and we will not take any responsibility for them. So again, it's a first come, first served basis, just to stress that to you. So I don't think there's anything, oh yes, of course, how can I forget our sub-librarian Noreen O'Connor. She wants to point out some of the health and safety features which should have really come before before me. But before introducing, yes, maybe I could ask Noreen to point out the health and safety before introducing Gerard.
Dave Galera Madden Tafalter of Goodyear Lowland. On behalf of the Library Service, I would like to welcome you all here this morning as we begin the 2019 O'Connell Summer School. Now, for your safety, I'd like you to note that we have 2 fire exits to the back, one on my right and one on my left. There are also 2 fire exits to the front, the main entrance where you came in, and also just adjacent to the registration table. Now, the bathrooms are on the corridor here to my left, and refreshments will be served in the room to the left also. So, Quintanivas.
At this point, I'd like to introduce Gerard and Hilary Collins. Jerry and Hilary are, as many of us will know, are long-time visitors here to South Kerry, and even though Gerard represented West Limerick for several years in Dáil Éireann, I think it's fair to say we can claim him as one of our own here in South Kerry as well. He even has the accent from time to time. So I think he passes. And the interest in the Mary's football team, which of course is also another qualification. So as many of you will know, Gerard has had a very distinguished career in public service, particularly in Oireachtas Éireann and of course in the European Parliament. As I said, he's represented Limerick West for nearly 30 years, I imagine, and during that time he held many important ministries, sometimes at particularly difficult times in the political history of our country, but I won't go into that. He was Minister for Foreign Affairs at particularly challenging times in relation to Anglo-Irish relations. He was Minister for Justice, Minister for Communications, as well as holding a number of other posts. He was also a member of the European Parliament, and in that capacity served as Vice President of the European Parliament, which was quite an influential position at a time really when the European Parliament was being reshaped to face into its second enlargement. So he held quite important positions at quite important times. But if I may say so, he's also our Gerard, because he and Hilary, as I said, are long-time visitors here. He's been a long-time supporter of the summer school, and I'd like to ask him now to say a few words and to formally open the school.
Ladies and gentlemen, there is a very good story to be told how I originally found my way down to Carrick-Sefine. Living on the borders with Kerry and Limerick, about 10 miles from Listowel, naturally my playground was Ballybunion because of golf and other things, but all that changed when I met the good lady. My thanks and appreciation to the committee of the Daniel O'Connell Summer School for 2019 for the invitation to say a few words, and only a few words, at the opening of the school this morning. It is most pleasing indeed to see so many people present, and I'm quite sure that they will enjoy listening to the contributions of the accomplished speakers on the very important issues before us for consideration. I would like to offer very, very sincere thanks to the director of the school, Maurice Brick, and the committee members for their efforts, and once again in ensuring a most interesting programme for this year's school. I might add that this school is one of the most important events in the South Kerry calendar, and it's something that we all look forward to. And we thank Maurice and Mary and Junior and other members of the committee for the great effort they put into organising this purely in a voluntary capacity, and we should never forget that. They are following, I believe, a great tradition of the founders of the O'Connell Association way back in the early 90s. I'm thinking of people like Tom Barrington, Maurice O'Connell, Dermot Kenlon, and indeed Mary O'Connor, who looks younger and better than ever, even though I'm talking about the early 90s, down at the Derrynane Hotel, an event that we enjoyed at the particular time. Their aim, as they stated, their objective at that time, and I quote, to stimulate thinking towards a national philosophy for a fully developed democratic Ireland in the uniting Europe, and in particular to explore the nature of the Irish state and how best to realise its potentialities. They saw Daniel O'Connell as having established a tradition of democracy in Ireland and wanted to see the extent to which his ideas and examples are relevant to the development of modern Ireland. Recently, while doing some research for today, and believe me, the older you get, the more research is required, my wife Hilary helped me considerably in resurrecting some of the printed records of the very fine contributions made at the O'Connell Association in the early 90s. These contributions, I might add, were compulsive reading and are worthwhile having available. I do recognise the practice of having printed records ceased for economic reasons, obviously, at some stage, and I can understand why. And I'm glad to learn on the grapevine that Ruth Barrington is going to do something about this particular area with the help of modern technology, so that the very fine contributions that we listen to from so many for such a long time will be available online to not just the people who are here, but to many of the younger people who really need to know far more about Daniel O'Connell than they would have got from their educational classes in their schools. And when I mentioned last night, I was thrilled to see Olivia O'Leary's programme. I enjoyed every bit of it. I think she did a superb job, and I'm looking forward to the next episode next week. So I would like to thank Ruth in advance of having all this material online, and it's something that will be very important. Might I add, on a personal basis, I really hope, I pray, that those who are advocating that we strike history teaching off our curriculum, that they might have a second thought about this. It would be a shame. I'm ever so pleased to see that the O'Connell Lecture for 2019 will be given by Seamus Malland, the former First Deputy Minister of Northern Ireland and the Deputy Leader of the SDLP. Seamus had the responsibility of trying to keep a political party together, a party advocating peace with justice for the people, keep them active in representing those who did not believe in violence and terrorism in achieving their aims and objectives. John Hume was extremely fortunate in having Seamus as his deputy, while he, John, successfully worked the international stage as he did. Seamus to me is a man of highest integrity and courage at all times against the force of evil, whose life I know from my own knowledge of what happened at the time, whose life was on a daily basis was constantly threatened. And we all welcome him to Cahersiveen on this occasion. It's not his first visit. No, it's not his first visit. He came on another occasion with John O'Donoghue, I'd say about maybe 10 years ago, Maurice. Yes. And I have a memory, which I'll have to cross-check with him, of bumping into him, as one would say, informally and casually, in the Towers Hotel in Glen Bay in the early 70s. The old memory is slipping a bit, but I think I have a recollection of that. Seamus recently published his memoirs, A Shared Home Place, and because I was incapacitated for a few days during the summer, I had an uninterrupted reading of this book, and parts of it I read more than once because it was so important that one fully understood and could take from it and learn from it on the situation as it developed then. One of Ireland's very best journalists, a journalist of the highest professional integrity, will conduct a very good interview with Seamus. That's our good friend, my good friend, same name as myself, Stephen Collins, who is one of the leading journalists in the country, most professional, most skilled, most analytical, and never influenced by the professional wags who try and influence the news that we get and the messages we should receive. I thank him for that. And I noticed that he has a colleague here with him too, sitting away below the back, Mr. De Brudoon. You two are welcome from the Irish Times. And you know, you would have taken over the place for the Irish Times if you brought, what do you call it, Fintan O'Toole with you. About that. By the way, for whom I regard very highly and whose articles I enjoy. May not always agree, but they're good. Now, for me, ladies and gentlemen, the important issues in the last chapter of Seamus Mallon's book, the question is Ireland ready for unification? That's the big question he asks. That's the big question I am looking forward to hearing answering in the afternoon. And I have no doubt, Stephen, you will be able to get us right into the core of that. For me, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, and as a former Minister for Justice with responsibility for the security of the state in 3 different governments over a long period of time, difficult times, and as Foreign Minister in 2 governments, co-chairing the Anglo-Irish Conference in the 80s and the 90s, and dealing with 6 different Secretaries of State for Northern Ireland, and being fully aware of the many most difficult issues to be overcome and the slow progress that was made to achieve peace with justice for all. I am not, I regret to say, at this stage as optimistic as I would want to be. I greatly regret the failure of the political parties in Northern Ireland to fully play their role for which they were elected and come together and fill the vacuum, the political vacuum that is presently being threatened by those who are engaging in violence. I firmly believe that Ireland is not yet ready for unification. I ask, are we even aware of what might be required of us to achieve this objective? The unification of our people. I ask, are both communities in Northern Ireland ready within themselves and with each other for unification of the people of the country? Regrettably, I believe not at this time. Those who presently, under the agreement, call for a referendum would do well by learning from the mistakes of the past. Yes, of course, we have come a long way, at a very great cost, a cost that we should never forget, that many thousands were killed and maimed, many innocent people. And indeed, it was only this week, 40 years ago, we saw the brutal assassination of Lord Louis of Mountbatten up in Mullaghmore, he and his family and his children and older people and he himself. I mention that because it's very much in my mind. I was here on that day and had to make my way to Mullaghmore. And the road ahead. This is what happens when you get old. Anyway, in conclusion, the road ahead for the unification of all the people on the island of Ireland is going to be a very challenging for all, and if we are to cross the finishing line together. Every success to Maurice, Mary, Junior and the rest of the committee who really make this occasion the most important occasion involving all the community here in this part of South Kerry, and we thank him again for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerard, very much for those remarks. And I'd now like to move on to the first session, which is called Shaping the Irish State. This is a session which will be chaired by Councillor Norman Moriarty, who's one of our councillors here in the southern part of the county. Has been a councillor here since 2014. She will chair the session and she will introduce the various speakers. And just to note that we are on schedule, 9:45. We're beginning at 9:45, and so forth. So again, can I invite Councillor Moriarty to come up here, Hugh Carrier, Yvonne and Mary McAuliffe, and as I said, Councillor Moriarty will do the honours. And before turning the podium over to Norma, can I also acknowledge the presence of Councillor Niall Kelleher, who is the Mayor of Kerry, and I want to give him a special welcome for taking the time and trouble for visiting us with us today. Thank you. And again, just to make the point, given that you're here, Niall, and given that Norma is here, just to acknowledge again the support which in a variety of ways the school gets from the Kerry County Council, from the CEO Myron Morell, from the County Library. We have Tommy O'Connor here, the County Librarian, who was here as well last night, and Owen O'Shea from the Communications Unit, who was here, and various other officials of the County Council. I said last year, this is not just about writing for cheques, even though we do that. And we're glad to have your support in acknowledging them, but it's also really about the moral support that you give us simply by being here and by lending us your support in that way. That is actually as important to us and trying to give us that oomph to go forward and to plan in even a bigger and a better way next year. So thank you again for coming. So at this point I'll hand over to Norma and ask her to.
Thank you, Maurice. I was absolutely delighted to be asked to do this. I've been somebody like yourselves who's been sitting in the audience from day one of this summer school, and I've loved every bit of it that I've been able to attend throughout those years. Jerry, you're absolutely correct when you use the word important. It's not just a great event and an enjoyable event, it's become a really important summer school. And every year I think we go learning something, we leave the place having learned something, and it does inform how we behave subsequently and indeed decisions that we make. And those of us who are fortunate enough to be elected representatives, I can assure you the decisions that we take, the votes that we carry out in council chambers are informed by what we hear here and what we learn here. So I think it is very important that we continue to attend and that we continue to have diverse opinions and that broad range of perspectives, because this is where we get to think about the big issues and hopefully contribute to them, okay, and the solutions to the many challenges that we all have. Now, the first session of 2019, Daniel O'Connell Summer School, we have 3 contributors, Professor Barry McAuliffe, Dr. Eucharia Meehan, and Professor Yvonne Galligan. Just a brief little bit on each of them. They're incredibly accomplished women, and like yourselves, I'm looking forward to what they're going to bring to us here today. Professor Mary McAuliffe is an Assistant Professor in Gender Studies at UCD, specialising in Irish women's and gender history. Mary lectures in Gender Studies programmes and is also a member of the Centre for Gender, Feminism and Sexualities at UCD. Her research interests include Irish women's history, gender, war, memory, oral history, social and political history, landscape history. And she's published in all of these areas. Some of her most recent publications are Richmond Barracks 1916, We Were There, 77 Women of the Easter Rising, and co-editor on Kerry 1916, Histories and Legacies of the Easter Rising, along with Bridget McAuliffe and indeed Owen O'Shea, who's currently working with Kerry County Council, who's also here, was also one of the co-editors there. Mary is currently completing a biography of the 1916 rebel feminist and trade unionist Margaret Skinner, and is also working on a major project on gender and sexual violence suffered by women during the Irish War of Independence and Civil War. She's president of the Women's History Association of Ireland and continues as a committee member and is, and is centenary founding of coordinated the 2014 commemoration conference on the centenary of the founding of Cumann na mBan. She has worked on 2 major commemoration projects. And continues to work on that commemoration, because as you know, we're in a series of commemorations, and we'll be coming up to obviously the commemorating the Civil War, which is going to be the most testing of all of them, and it's very important that we do that really well, okay, for the next 100 years that we get that particularly right. So basically, Mary's very idle, all right, from what I've just said there. Dr. Eucharia Meehan has over 20 years leadership experience across a range of public and private research-based organisations. She is currently CEO at the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies, which is the only such institute in Ireland. Since its inception, it has focused on fundamental frontier and discovery research. DS has a rich legacy, and in late 2018, under her leadership, it launched its new strategy, Embedded Globally, Strength Locally. A proven track record throughout her career of achievement in strategy development and organisational transformation. She's an acknowledged leader in advancing gender equality and diversity policies, in particular as Director of the Irish Research Council. Designated Science Europe's first gender and diversity champion, 2016 and 17. She attained the highest academic honour in the island of Ireland in 2017 with her election as a member of the Royal Irish Academy, and was further honoured with her election to its council the following year. In addition to National Committee membership by virtue of her leadership roles at a European level, she was until recently an elected board member of both Science Europe, the Pan-European Association for Research Funding and Research Performing Organisations, and the European Strategy Forum for Research Infrastructures. So again, another busy lady. And Professor Yvonne Galligan. Yvonne Galligan is Director of Equality, Diversity and Inclusion at Technological University Dublin. As Professor of Comparative Politics, she's published widely on gender and politics, democracy and the gendered nature of power. She was previously in Queen's University Belfast, where she led the university to Silver Athena Swan accreditation. Yvonne's current research examines the gendered nature of higher education, and she received an honorary doctorate from the University of Edinburgh in 2017 for her contribution to social science, and was made an honorary fellow of Trinity College Dublin in 2014 in recognition of her scholarship and contribution to higher education. So we are in exalted company, and I look forward to the many contributions. There will be a question and answer opportunity, but we will go through our three presentations first. So hang on to those questions, make notes of them, and we'll have the floor open to you. So we'll begin with Dr. McConnell. And Professor Collier.
Good morning, everyone, and it's a great honour to be the first speaker at 2019 O'Connell Summer School, and of course great to be back in Kerry, even if it is South Kerry. I'm a North Kerry person, and you would have gone through my village of Dwa on your way to Ballybunion back in the day. So thank you very much to all the committee for inviting me here, and what I want to talk to you today is about my ongoing research in this decade of centenaries on the contribution, impact and legacies of the women of the revolutionary period, and you'll be glad to know that Margaret Skinner biography has gone in. So that's one thing done. So as we move through this decade of centenaries, Irish women's participation in the experiences of the War of Independence and the Civil War will now take centre stage. We have, as they say, done 1916, although of course it's never done, and more research keeps coming out about that. So narratives of the heroics of the Cumann women, of running safe houses, managing arms dumps, dispatch carrying, transporting arms, are well established in the histories. And as are the cultural myths of the self-sacrificing mothers, the wives, the daughters, whose actions after the war were couched almost exclusively in terms of remaking the secure, respectable, moral, domestic space for the sake of the family and the nation. Women and the war, if spoken about at all, was often discussed at a time when proper femininity and proper behaviours of women were disrupted, where their activities as militant Republicans led to their construction post-war, particularly after Cumann had rejected the treaty, as unmanageable, ungovernable revolutionaries or furies. So the experience of women was therefore best forgotten or best remade or reimagined. But in recent decades, studies of conflict and trauma have shown that the gendered connections and disconnections between mainstream histories and the othered memories of war and trauma need to be unpacked and re-looked at again. So using a gendered lens to unlock this masculinist narrative of war, and with gender as a firm category of analysis, I seek to disrupt this traditional narrative. With the multiplicities of new sources, and many of you have probably consulted the military archives and the Bureau of Military History and all those wonderful digitised online sources, as well as the sources that remain, many of them still unlooked at in any great way in archives here and in Britain and elsewhere. And rereading these older sources, we can now better understand the gendered effects of war and violence. Using women's personal narratives, military pension applications, Bureau of Military History, memoirs. For example, a large part of my biography of Margaret Skinner, I used her, well, certainly up to 1916, I used her 1917 memoir, Doing My Bit for Ireland, which was published as a polemic propaganda piece, but contains a lot of material on what women actually did during the Rising and coming up to the Rising. So using all these again, I will look at how we can now reread and expand on, in a broader and in more nuanced way, the experiences of women, the contribution of women, and how that contribution was remembered and is now changing in that memory. So I want to look at two outstanding trends I'm using in my research for the period 1919-1922. One, and this, I think, is a great photo. This is Cumann women marching in Tralee for women's rights in 1955. So they never gave up. The one is the contribution of Cumann na mBan to the military struggle, and I'm looking directly at some Kerry cases today, and then the violence experienced by women, especially those women in Cumann na mBan or associated with the military struggle. And this is part of my research on genders and sexual violence, how the Cumann na mBan women, because they didn't generally go on the run, were actually on the front line when it came to reprisals and the violence they suffered because of their military activities. At the Cumann na mBan Annual Convention in 1918, a declaration of its policies was issued. Its first aim was to follow the policy of the Republican Proclamation to see that women take up their proper position in the life of the nation. And of course, this was the promise of equality in the Proclamation of Independence. They were also to fundraise and equip a body of men and women, and to develop military activities in conjunction with the Irish Volunteers. So they're seeing themselves as related to and working with the Irish Volunteers as comrades in this struggle. This note clearly reveals a desire on the part of Cumann na mBan to become the military equals of the Volunteers, to be allies rather than to simply remain auxiliaries. Despite this stance on equality, the reality was different. On the ground, Cumann na mBan locally often looked to the local IRA commanders for military leadership and went along with them in their plans rather than themselves being in the leadership roles. In the 1919 Lara na mBan, it is suggested that the captain of the local branch keep in touch with the volunteer battalion to get his help in organising signalling and other classes, and to put herself under his orders in all military operations. So you can see that close relationship is developing by 1919. If we look then at the first shots of the War of Independence, which were fired at Soloheadbeg, although some dispute there were earlier engagements, but we'll take it Soloheadbeg for today's purposes, where two RIC constables escorting a group of workers carrying gelignite from a local quarry were ambushed and killed by local volunteers, including some of the big four: Dan Breen, Sean Tracy, Sean Hogan, Seamus Robinson, and a few others who would go on to form the core of the 3rd Tipperary Brigade. Coincidentally, on that day, 21st of January 1919, was also the meeting of the First Dáil at the Mansion House in Dublin. How do we read then the participation in women in the War of Independence from the very beginning, particularly from that opening salvo, using the military archives and other sources? It is important to relook at all aspects of women's contributions and experience. While first aid, signalling and dispatch carrying was the usual work, there is evidence that the work they carried out, even as early as January 1919, contributed to the military side of the war. So, let's take a closer look at Soloheadbeg. I will get to Kerry. Recently, a blog on the military pension site has shown that we can do a gendered inclusive reading of the Soloheadbeg ambush on that date in January 1919. Dan Breen and Sean Tracy are among the men most famous for the ambush, but using the military archives, we see there was a full Cumann na mBan involvement in the ambush that you rarely hear about. From the archives, we know that the 3rd Tipperary Brigade had 8 IRA men in position, 2 volunteers on bicycles, and a number of Cumann na mBan women on scout duty. For example, Kate Coffey of the Dunohill Company of Cumann na mBan said in her pension application that she provided intelligence in the run-up to the ambush and did scout work 500 yards from the scene of the shooting. Marion Tobin of Cahir took in at least 3 IRA members of the ambush and helped find them safe houses after the ambush. Dan Breen, in a handwritten letter of reference, said that Tobin was the most trusted person in Tipperary. Sean Tracy, Sean Hogan and myself went to her home after Soloheadbeg, and it was Mrs. Tobin who made contact for us and houses for us for several days when the area was very hot. Mrs. Tobin was well known to E. O'Malley, Dennis Lacey, Seamus Robinson, and her pet was Sean Tracy. This type of service was typical of the invaluable and dangerous service Cumann na mBan women provided throughout the country during the War of Independence. Much of what they did was what is expected of an auxiliary force, but it was also indispensable to the conduct of guerrilla warfare. The women provided service in a number of important areas, running safe houses and caring for IRA men, as Mrs. Tobin did, nursing injured volunteers, providing lines of communication, which was vital, carrying dispatches and taking care of arms dumps. Food, shelter and care were vital for the success of the guerrilla army, and the women's role in this provision is often dismissed as within their domestic duties. They were doing it because they would be doing it anyway. But I think you have to look at it in a broader context. They were doing, without that, how would the IRA have actually conducted guerrilla warfare? And I will argue here that the involvement of Cumann na mBan in direct military action is something that is overlooked, because without them, guerrilla warfare engaged in by the IRA could not have been successfully carried out. Throughout 1919 and early 1920, Cumann na mBan continued to train at signalling, dispatch carrying, first aid, and providing all necessary backup for local IRA brigades. In Kerry now, Nellie Moynihan, captain of the Kearns branch, for instance, states that in the 1919-1920 period, as captain, she instructed my company at regular intervals, attended first aid classes, and instructed company on the same, carrying dispatches, and cooperated in every way possible with the volunteer force, assisting them in their work where the occasion arose. While first aid, signalling, and dispatch carrying was the usual work, there is evidence that Kerry women also worked on the military side of things. Hannah O'Sullivan of Cahersiveen, who belonged to the Glencar branch, mentioned in her military pension file, she was Nee Clifford, so you might recognise that name. She kept arms and ammunition and catered for men on the run while providing clothes for them. And you have to remember this is very important as well, because they were getting drenched up on the mountainside. Without warm, dry clothing, they could have gotten sick, pneumonia, etc. So this part of this supply line that the women are undertaking is vital to the well-being of the army. She mentioned she often travelled to Killorglin to get supplies. Nora Nurse, Nee O'Sullivan, a member of the Castle Gregory branch, mentioned in her pension file that she worked with the local volunteers in Dingle and Aunaskole in the production of shot and powder. She washed and prepared a quality of wool that was used to experiment in the making of gun cotton. The experiment proved successful, which they then used. By July 1920, the situation in Kerry was fraught as the county inspector wrote, "The relations between the police and the people have not improved, and boycotting of police increases daily as a result of terrorism. Attacks, ambushes, burnings were all on the increase. In July, 2 RIC constables were shot dead between Cloghane and Dingle. Abandoned RIC stations were being attacked and burned. Ardfert, Ballyhigh, Templenoe, Headford, and on April 4th, Ballinaskelligs were burned. Attacks on RIC men continued. Tralee Courthouse was burnt in April, and Constable Martin Clifford was killed at Bardley's Cross near Waterfall on the 17th of April. By the summer of 1920, the apparatus of British government was effectively neutralised within most of the county. All of this led to the increased presence of the Crown forces, which led, of course, to the arrival of the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries in the county. As violence escalated and the guerrilla campaign began in earnest in late 1920, Cumann na mBan threw their energies behind the activities of the IRA. Much of what they did, you can say, was expected of an auxiliary force, but it was also indispensable. They ran the safe houses, they did the food and shelter, they did all the roles that Dan Breen said were indispensable to the army, but the other roles, he said, carried a more military aspect, including carrying dispatches, scouting, and acting as intelligence agents. Their work as intelligence agents, which I think is often overlooked, was vital to the well-being of the IRA, as Breen said. The involvement then of the women in military actions needs to be looked at in more detail. For instance, acquiring, delivering and caring for arms and ammunition was of extreme importance to the IRA, and much of this was carried out by Cumann na mBan. Intelligence work, scouting and delivery of arms and ammunition to sites of ambushes was also very important to the military side. Women who lived near RIC stations and barracks where Black and Tans and auxiliaries were housed were a vital link in the intelligence chain for the local IRA. In Killarney, Molly Moynihan, Nee Murphy of the Rathmore Cumann na mBan was very active. In July 1920, she travelled by horse and cart to Killarney on one occasion for sulphur and saltpetre, and to Cahills and Rathmore for a crusher to make powder, and did sentry duty with the IRA men when they used her house and made powder and charcoal and stored it, and worked on 2 cannons which were taken from Rosscastle in Killarney. One of the castle was used on the attack on Rathmore Barracks, and prior to attack, contingents from Cork and Kerry came to her house, with the Cork contingent leaving behind 2 rifles for the Kerrymen. There's one woman in her house going about her daily duties and yet doing all this ordnance work for the IRA. Sometimes the Cumann women carried out their duties under extreme conditions of extreme dangers. Again, Nora Nurse of the Castle Gregory branch remembered that Castle Gregory in November 1920 was surrounded by auxiliaries, and she and 2 other women removed arms in their shawls from the dump held in the house of Dr. Ferris to a place of safety. The thing was that the women generally, the British didn't recognise what the women were doing for a very, very long time. So they could actually get away in plain sight with moving large quantities of arms and ammunition, with dispatch carrying, with intelligence work. They often also took the unenviable, difficult and traumatic work of caring and burying the dead of those IRA men, many of whom were their friends and comrades or relations who were killed in ambushes. Because the men on the run couldn't retrieve the bodies, it was often the women who had to go and retrieve the bodies, wash them, prepare them for burial, and then conduct the ceremonials, as well as many times taking in arms and ammunition into the graveyard so the shots could be fired over the burials. I want to look at a couple of incidents in Kerry. So this is how I'm doing my research. I'm taking different ambushes and events and inserting the women into the stories. So I want to look at 2 incidents in Kerry, one of which is Hillville in Killorglin, where Josephine, it was an ambush in October 1920. Josephine Cashman states she joined Cumann in Killorglin in 1920 and was shortly afterwards appointed captain of the Kilcobbinett branch and was engaged in routine activities including attending parades, drilling, collecting funds, organising dances, attending first aid lectures. All very Cumann work. She mentions her family had 2 houses, one in Brookville and one in the Black Valley. She says she rendered service in Killorglin, Glencar, Ballymalice and Glenbay areas as a scout and dispatch rider. She made ammunition in Kinmare when members of the Flying Column were there and kept guard while the column made an attack on the Crown forces in Killorglin. Like many Cumann women, she did intelligence gathering, watching the activities of the Crown forces and reporting back to the Active Service Unit on police and military movements. These reports were vital for any planning that the IRA were doing because they knew then the activities and the movements of the Black and Tans. She claims she did scout duty for the IRA before and after the attack at Hillville in Killorglin, where an enemy patrol was attacked in March 1921. On that evening, 2 RIC men were returning for leave were ambushed. The report by the Listry Company of the Irish Volunteers who carried out the action is available from the Bureau of Military History witness statements. And Daniel Healy, who was a lieutenant, said, Daniel Ullman was told that the 2 Tans had gone to Killorglin from Killorglin towards Milltown along the main road. The 2 Tans came along on cycles and acting on orders, one of our party called on them to halt. They ignored the call and attempted to cycle through. Our party had our orders to fire on the Tans if they failed to halt. We opened fire and they killed the 2 men. We captured 1 revolver as one of the Tans was unarmed. One of our party was armed with 3 rifles, 1 revolver, and the remainder had shotguns. After that attack, the guns were handed over to the Cumann women, who then hid them and made them available for future attacks. Reprisals were swift, as they always were, and it was reported that people slept little in Killorglin that night, or for many nights afterwards, as the killings were avenged. Windows were smashed, Miss McCollum's house was burnt, and the Sinn Féin hall was set alight, and the Old Men, which housed the creamery, was burnt to the ground. Burning creameries was very much part of reprisals because, of course, it was integral to the local economic life of a community. What is not mentioned in the witness statement is that it was Josephine Cashman who did the scout duty before the attack, again after the attack to make sure the volunteers got away, and she also took the guns from the Active Service Unit for safekeeping. The second one I want to look at is in North Kerry. 7th of April 1921, the North Kerry Flying Column decided to make an attack on the Crown forces when they had received word that the Crown forces had gone to Kilmorna House, the home of Sir Arthur Vickers, between Dwa and Listowel. In Kerry's fighting story, a report on the attack indicates the involvement of women. As members of the North Kerry Flying Column approached Kilmorna, the women, they set out first for Mrs. Larkin's, a safe house in Kilmorna. They gave a dispatch to Ms. Larkin, her daughter, for transmission, and after that moved rapidly towards Mrs. Stack's and over the fields to Kilmorna. After the attack ended in the death of IRA man Lieutenant Michael Galvin, who was shot dead, the column retreated towards Larkin's and then on to another safe house. The body of Galvin was taken away by the Crown forces to the Ristole barracks, where no one, including it is said his mother, could identify him for fear of reprisals. The RIC buried him in Templing Bawn. However, the Cumann women were watching where he was being buried, and they dug him up and took him home to his home graveyard to be buried, including Maya Hearn. Maya Hearn deserves a study of her own. She's in the middle there. You wouldn't recognise her, but she's up at the top, with right in the middle. She has got a tie on. She was involved from the beginning and vital to the activities of the North Kerry Flying Column, carrying dispatches, providing a safe house, kept a captured soldier in her house for over a month, kept all the guns and ammunition. At one stage, herself and 3 women, when the train was stopped at Kilmorna, there was guns coming from Dublin. The train was surrounded by the Black and Tans. The 3 women walked in, as calm as you like, secreted the guns on their person and walked out through the Black and Tans. So you had to have a very steady nerve to do what they did. Her referee, Thomas Collins, mentioned she got the bombs and ammunition away from the train at Kilmorna, despite the fact that up to 30 Black and Tans surrounded the station and were searching baggage. As Dennis Quill said of her, he was commander of the North Kerry Flying Column, he was glad to be in a position to state the worth of this girl, who gave us such continuous and material help during this trying period. Thomas Kennelly, OC of the 3rd Battalion, said she was one of the best girls in Kerry in 1920 and 21. However, despite all of this, like so many of the women whose activities were vital to military operations, Maya Hearn, Josephine Cashman, and all the women I've mentioned up to now, all got the grade E in their military pension files, which was the lowest grade, because they weren't recognised as combatants or frontline soldiers. Their invaluable work of Cumann, who throughout Kerry and indeed throughout the country in the War of Independence contributed to the success, I suppose, of the IRA in fighting the Crown forces to a standstill, did come at a very high cost. Even though they were members of a prescribed organisation, they could not go on the run. This meant they often experienced the full brutality of reprisals conducted by the Crown forces. As Lil Conlon, a member of Cork Cumann, wrote in her memoirs, from late 1920, attention was focused on the women very much by the authorities. They were in receipt of information from their intelligence divisions, owing to raids and captures of documents, and they fully realised, finally, that women were playing a major part in the campaign. The going, she said, was tough on the female sex. They were unable to go on the run, so were constantly subjected to having their homes raided and precious possessions destroyed. It is during this period that Cumann women began to experience the worst of the reprisals, when masked raiders came to threaten and bully and burn them out of their homes. Descriptions in sources like the Military Pensions, the Bureau of Military History, and other archival material detail that. We find examples if we look closely at Kerry. For example, Kate Mannix, Nee Barrett of the Cordell branch, details the rough treatment she encountered during a raid on a house of Nora McCarthy, where she was made cook for the raiding party and was thrown against a wall. Again, there's a lot of euphemism used in the way the women describe the treatment they got, but they're often mistreated in isolation, surrounded by gangs of men, and there is hints of sexual assaults or sexual violence in a lot of the material. Kate Mannix said she was frequently abused by the raiders. Lena Dowling, Nee Sheehan of the Art Frert branch, mentioned the threats, abuse and insults that she and her mother and sister had to put up with when the forces raided their home. In Castlemaine, Amelia Mason was forced to leave her house for a fortnight by British forces that raided her family home on a number of occasions. In Castle Island, Ellen McGillicuddy, a member of the local Cumann, whose home was frequently targeted by the Crown forces, sometimes raided twice a day, and was eventually burnt out in May 1921. Lizanne O'Brien, a founder member of the Tralee Cumann, said her house was raided so often she lost her business. In all of these communities, it is the women, and indeed children in houses, that suffered the brutality of reprisals. Women generally weren't killed, but the brutality of the treatment they got. There is one woman whose statement I often remember. She was from Julia Duffy, a woman in Longford, and she just states quite prosaically, "I was raided one night and beaten so badly the Black and Tans knocked out 9 of my teeth." And then she said, I continued my work for Ireland after that. So they are very stoic in their acceptance that this type of treatment is part of their what is happening to them as soldiers for Ireland, and so they can keep going. And a lot of times they deflect, I suppose, their feelings on the treatment. So they talk about their mother's nerves being gone or their sister's nerves being gone, not themselves. They continue on. And I think we need to do research then on PTSD, as we would call it today, among women after the war is over. So this is a snapshot I'm doing of on the activities of Cumann na mBan, who were integral to the independence campaign. In their more domestic role as carers and their roles as militants, they provided a service without which the campaign conducted by the IRA could not have succeeded to the extent it did. Their ability to move freely as women meant their roles as scouts, intelligence gatherers, message carriers, and their expertise in securing and secreting and transporting arms and ammunition was vital. This is acknowledged in a 1921 letter by IRA commandants who said there is no question that the women were only helping. In dispatch carrying, scouting and intelligence work, all of which was highly dangerous, they did far more than the soldiers. But notice they call the women the girls and the men the soldiers. So even when they're getting praised, the women get gendered as well. The fact that the women could not go on the run meant that they experienced the full brutality of reprisals carried out by Crown forces. Both their contribution and their suffering, however, is often ignored or overlooked in both national and regional studies. As Marie Coleman notes in the Fighting Stories series produced by the Kerrymen in the 1940s, the role of Cumann na mBan branches was relegated to a couple of pages at the end. When the women are remembered in the traditional histories of the revolutionary period, it was as the loyal and courageous Cumann na mBan girls. Again, we'll go back to our women. They certainly don't look like girls. Who cared for and looked after the men who were fighting for Ireland. The complexities, though, of women's participation in the revolutionary period became victim to selective and gendered remembering. Their contributions and experiences were downplayed, overlooked, or simply forgotten. Women were there to be the caring supportive auxiliaries to the fighting men, courageous and loyal and brave, but not militants, not combatants. Recent histories, however, particularly regional histories, are challenging that narrative. Historians, and I must say still mainly female historians, are revisiting this narrative, which has allowed a process of recovery of women's history in all their complexities be undertaken. Revisiting existing archival sources and using newly available material allows us an expansion on the detail of what the women did and why they did it. We also have to understand what motivated them, their ideologies. It wasn't because their fathers did it or their brothers did it. They truly believed in republicanism as well. And indeed, we can see that then in the response of Cumann na mBan to the treaty. Without the Cumann na mBan women, the history of the War of Independence in Kerry and nationally would be very different. So, in conclusion, what I'll say is what the women did was central to the narrative, and what they did deserves to be known and included in all the histories of the period. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. And I am struck by what you say there about probably the need to look into the PTSD element of that, because one of the things that came across as well as part of the 1916 commemorations, when people were recounting stories of their own family members and remembering how they managed post-1916, and the number of them that didn't speak about it, or that may have acquired addiction issues with alcoholism or whatever, because you have very ordinary people thrown into extraordinary situations and having to cope with things that really, in their normal run of life, if things had been peaceful and normal, they wouldn't have had to endure or encounter. So, of course, that has an impact and it takes a toll, and it probably explains quite a lot of some of the social issues that we as a nation have had to deal with subsequently. Our next speaker, looking forward to this immensely, Dr. Eucharia Meehan. So, no further ado, thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the kind introduction earlier. I'm delighted to be here this morning to address you on the topic of women in science in a historical and societal context, because this is an area, both the history of science in Ireland itself and the history of women in science, they are two areas which are often neglected And I'd like to thank the programme organisers, in fact, for including this topic on the agenda today. This topic is not a topic you will find in many history books, and as I said, it's an oft-forgotten area, but hopefully we will begin to address that. I'm particularly delighted to be here in Kerry at this summer school because, of course, I think a lot of you in the room will be aware that there are a number of women with close associations to this area who actually made very important contributions to science over the decades. I will put my hand up right now and say Mary was talking earlier about South Kerry and North Kerry and making differentiations between those areas. When I talk about the Southwest region, I am going to include Limerick and Cork. So I hope no one in the room is going to have a problem with that. My engagement with this topic actually began about 25 years ago when I was involved in an organisation called Women in Technology and Science. And it published a book called Star, Shells and Bluebells under the editorship of the late Mary Mulvihill. And that really was the first publication that emerged about the role of women in science in Ireland. And subsequent to that, we got involved in a campaign to get plaques erected to women scientists in partnership with a national ad hoc committee for commemorative plaques that had been set up. So I was involved with that particular project. There were many women that contributed in different ways to the evolution of science. For example, in the area of science and technical education. But today I am going to focus deliberately on those who have left behind a scientific or innovation legacy, which actually goes beyond their gender and which withstands the test of time. And you will see that the areas in which those impacts were made, even by the few examples that I take from this area alone, were across diverse areas such as botany, chemistry, maths, medical science and zoology. Before I get into telling you a little bit about the stories of some of those women, which is the really interesting part of the talk, I do need to say just a quick word about the evolution of science itself, how the very activity of science and scientific research changed over the period I'm talking about, which would be from the late 1700s up to the late 1900s. The overarching point I really need to make here is that the nature of science and its pursuit changed dramatically. In effect, prior to the late 19th and early 20th century, science really was conducted and pursued by individuals for the love of knowledge. It was not seen as a profession. It was the purview of those with curiosity and time, mainly in the main those who would be classed as comfortable. And whether they were male or female, clearly they had to have an interest in science. And this meant that it was mainly those from the aristocratic or middle class backgrounds who engaged in science. Political and cultural factors of that era, particularly the earlier part of the time that I'm speaking of, meant that most of these individuals were Protestants. And in fact, if you look at the cases of individuals that have been uncovered to this point over the whole island of Ireland, there is a preponderance actually of daughters of rectors among those actually that engaged in science. That won't be so evident today because of the sample I'm taking, but that has been commented on by a number of writers about the subject. However, whilst women engaged in science across that time, they were of course constrained by the social norms of whatever time we're speaking of. As time went on, their limited education increasingly became a barrier, particularly after the transitionary period between the late 1800s and early 1900s, when science began to be professionalised, and I'll come back to that. However, if the women had access to books, could self-educate themselves in scientific topics, and as you will see, if they had access through family members or friends to scientific discourse or to others conducting science, they really could advance their work. Social convention, however, ensured that in spite of their contributions, that they remained invisible and at the margins, because to a large extent at that time their contributions were not acknowledged directly. For example, in the 18th and much of the 19th century, much of the discussion about science and discourse about science was oral, and in fact that really led to the emergence of what we now call learned societies to facilitate this type of engagement. So whilst there was some publishing, a lot of interaction and discourse actually took place through lectures and discussions. The RDS, which was founded in 1731, and the Dublin Zoological Society, now known as the Zoo, which was founded in the 1830s, held regular meetings and lectures. And I specifically mention them because they actually allowed women to attend. I'm not going to mention those that didn't. It was a different matter, however, if women wanted to contribute at the lectures to the discussion. And there are instances, depending on the decade we look at, and there are instances on record where it is shown that letters were read out on behalf of the women by a male family member if they had an idea or something they wanted to contribute. If materials being published, women also were anonymous or pseudo-anonymous. In many instances their work was actually included, and maybe as a footnote it was noted that they contributed to the work of a male friend, family member or a colleague that they had met. And this actually was a good thing actually, because this has allowed us actually to pursue some of those footnotes and actually track back and see what the contribution of women were. Also, particularly back in the late 1700s, early 1800s, women scientists were involved in the illustration of publications. And this activity was deemed as acceptable, as it was closely related to drawing and art. So the women were not doing science, they were really doing drawing and art. But in fact, if you look at some of the illustrations, it's very clear that they obviously had a very intimate interest in the subject matter, and we'll see a couple of examples of that shortly. Nowhere is the area of illustration and drawing and the contribution of women more evident in that late 18th century, 19th century period than when one looks at the preponderance of female naturalists of the time, women who collected, classified and catalogued items from the natural world which surrounded them. And this, of course, was the era where the natural sciences, botany, zoology were very important, because it was considered also almost in terms of religion to be important, to value the natural world, to study what God had created. So it wasn't just the fact that it was easy to do. We actually knew very little at that time about our natural surroundings. And this really brings me then to my first female example. So the first person I'm just going to say a few words about is the woman who is now acknowledged as being, or certainly has been given the title as Ireland's first woman or female botanist. And that was Ellen Hutchins, who was a daughter of a large tenant farmer and fisherman who was born in Ballylickey, County Cork, and then in later life, for complicated family reasons to do with inheritance and estates and things which I'm not going to get into, she actually ended her life at the home of her brother in Ardnagashel, near Bantry, County Cork. Ellen, who you can see actually on the slide, if you can see the dates there, lived between 1785 and 1815, suffered from ill health, and you can see her there in the middle of the picture on the left. Was actually encouraged when she was being educated in Dublin to engage in outdoor pursuits because of her health, and this led to her actual interest in plants and in nature. So she started in Cork, making notes, gathering samples, sending them to various organisations, and she came to the attention of the Linnean Society, which obviously was a very prestigious society based in London. Her work came to their attention to the extent that she was asked in 1808 to complete a catalogue of plants of all kinds that she found in this broad region. And over 3 years she did a huge piece of work which catalogued no less than 1,200 plants, and in particular she documented many mosses, liverworts, seawards and lichens, many of which had never really come into the public domain. Because of this work, quite a number of plants, a few dozen, are actually named after her. A flower, I'll just give you 2 examples to show you the range of things that are named after her. A small white flower called the Hutchinsia alpina was named after her, and then a lichen called the Cania hutchisana just gives you 2 examples. And indeed, after her death, the fact that she had done this cataloguing was so well known that in fact plants continued to be named after her. On the slide here, we can see the memorial stone that was erected at the family burial ground in 2002, and in fact up to that time there was no acknowledgement on her grave of her scientific work. And in fact the plaque that you see here on the bottom right was erected in 2014 when the good people of Bantry decided to inaugurate a festival celebrating her work. Similarly, there are 2 other, in fact 3 other ladies from the Broad area. I will just mention from this particular area, again the sort of early to mid 1800s. The Ball sisters, Mary and Anne from Cove, again were likely self-educated, middle class. We actually know very little about their background. But they were interested in snails, insects and shells primarily, and a number of algae and mollusks and crustaceans are named after each one of these individuals. They were an example of women who were fortunate in that their brother, who also was a naturalist and very interested in science, actually became a founding member of the Zoological Society, and later on became a director of the museum in Trinity. And through him, they met a lot of international scientists, and thus their work became known in that way. Just one interesting thing I'll just say to you is, I don't know particularly the fisher men and women among you, the next time you hear the water bugs making that noise that they make, that kind of jarring noise, which actually is parts of their bodies rubbing together. In fact, it was Mary Ball who actually first discovered how that happens, how those insects actually make that noise. My final mention for this area is of Catherine Bailey, and on the right here we see a book that she published in 1833. She was born in Limerick, but after the death of her mother and the remarriage of her father, she moved to live with relatives in Killiney. And those relatives had a lot of academic and intellectual connections. She is in some sources designated as being the first woman botanist in Ireland because she published this book herself. But I think the good people of Bantry are going to make sure that designation goes by the wayside. Because in fact this book didn't really contain any original material, important and all as it was at the time, to really bring botany to the fore. And for that reason it was of note. For those maybe historians of you in the audience, just of interest, she actually eventually married Robert Kane, who actually was the first president of UCC, and there's a whole story about her and him, which we don't have time to get into today. The work that she did, obviously publishing this book at the time, really helped popularise science and what was actually happening. And of course that is a very important activity even to this day. There is another notable example locally, some of you may not think locally, but I think locally, of an individual who made a huge international impact in terms of the advancements of science, to the extent that I really cannot leave her out. And that is Agnes Mary Clerk from Skibbereen, daughter of a bank manager who had a classics education, but who had a passion for astronomy. And she was educated at home by her scholarly parents. Now, Agnes, again, each one of these women have a fantastic story, which I don't have time to get into. But let's just say, at the age of 25, she moved to London, and that's where her career as a scientific writer really took off. She actually published a number of books, but the most best-known one is her popular history of astronomy during the 19th century. And in fact, it is still recommended, even to this day, as a text for students of astronomy. She was very fortunate in that she actually met a man named Norman Lockyer, who actually founded the publication Nature. which I say most of you in the room would have heard of. It now has become the place that if you're a scientist, everyone wants to get published in. So in fact, he set it up around that time. So she became a contributor to that. So she became very, very well known. And in fact, she is still so well known that and you'll be wondering why I have this up here. This actually is a picture of the moon. And I don't know if you can see just here, there is a crater on the moon named after her. And the crater was actually named after her by NASA in her honour after they did an international consultation in 1981 asking astronomers who this crater should be named after. And she emerged. So that gives you some idea of the fact that she is really well known among the astronomy community internationally. So this work of popularising science and sharing knowledge is of course very important for the strengthening of science. But as we move forward now from this era, we begin to enter the period when science started to be taken away from the local environment and became more inaccessible. Around this time, which is the time then of the Industrial Revolution, governments became interested in science and technology for what it could do economically. I think there's a certain resonance with that even today. Professional courses and degrees started to be established. And of course, because women had so little foundational education, the whole entry to universities then became another barrier. Even after women were facilitated to enter university, and that was from 1880 onwards in Ireland. It was basically, from a social perspective, not seen as being necessary or important that women should have equal education with their male counterparts. Access to scientific discourse and bodies also became more difficult, but women still continued to conduct science and innovate even as these changes were happening. And I'll just show you another example here of Alicia Boole Stott, born in Cork City. She's very well known because she was the daughter of the famous George Boole, who was the father of Boolean logic, which is so important today in computing. He, of course, died when she was quite young. But after the family moved to England, through contacts of her mother's, she actually started to get engaged in mathematics. And she actually went on to she coined the term polytopes, and she discovered a great variety of uniform polytopes, which if you're a mathematician you probably understand. But it really has to do with the configuration of four-dimensional shapes. And she was very seminal in some of that work. And she's called, in fact, the Princess of Polytopes. Another example of someone who actually I suppose emerged at this time, again with no formal education, and really managed to buck the trend, if you like, was Annie Massey, who was born in Galbally in Limerick. Again, no formal education, but had such an interest and published a little bit, and she came to the attention of the newly formed Department of Agriculture and Technical Instruction, who actually employed her then as an expert on the identification of molluscs, that's slugs and aquatic snails, shellfish and such creatures. And she identified many species at that time, and that really was her avenue then through that professional work, even though she didn't have an education in the area. And in fact, on the right here, you can see a cuttlefish that's actually named after her, whose Latin name I'm not going to pronounce. But of course, in spite of how marvellous this was, there is another who I need to speak about, who actually not only bucked, I suppose, the barriers of social convention, lack of education, and her social circumstance, but actually went on to go beyond collecting and identifying things to actually studying things and actually looking how things evolve. And that actually is a bit of a shift, if you like. And that woman, of course, is Maud James Delap of this parish. And I'm quite intimidated actually saying anything about her in this audience, because there are a number of people in the audience who know a lot more about her than I do. So questions can go in a number of directions. Maud, I'm delighted to say, was born in my own home county, County Donegal, at the Temple Crone Rectory. And she moved to Valencia when she was 8. And her father, of course, as you will know, was the rector here in Valencia and Cathersabine. In spite of her father's liberal leanings, she was one of 6 girls and one of 4 brothers, and for that reason she received no formal education. Her father was a keen naturalist, sending specimens to the National History Museum and writing for the Irish Naturalist, and Maud took after him. The big event which really propelled her, if you like, forward into the national and international consciousness was the fact that in the 1890s, Valencia was chosen as a site for a detailed marine study. And the choice, it seems, was based in part due to her own work, the work of her sister Constance and their father Alexander. And it was Edward Brown of University College London who led that expedition in 1895. And the de Lapps are acknowledged as having been critical to the success of that survey because they'd gathered so many samples in advance and indeed went on to gather and collect samples long after the expedition concluded. Her work is acknowledged in the publications through the Royal Irish Academy. Constance and her, I suppose, worked together for a period of time, but Constance then was not involved in the rearing experiments that were Maud's tour de force that really brought her to international prominence. Maud was involved in rearing jellyfish and looking at their life cycle, and the rearing of jellyfish in of itself in captivity is actually quite a difficult task. And just a little bit of science, I suppose, just to explain just a little bit why this was important. Jellyfish occur in two forms, the Medusa and the Hydra, and at the time of the experiments it wasn't known which particular species belonged which Medusa belonged to which Hydra. So Maud actually basically took different species of jellyfish, let them grow, took them at different stages and studied them and really elucidated this. Her work was published in the Irish Naturalist. Her laboratory, I think a lot of you will know, was in a room in her house in Renellen in Knightstown. It was christened her department. And I think the fact that she became so well known and her work became so important is reflected in the fact that in 1906 she was offered a job at the Marine Biology Station in Plymouth. But again, we are told that she couldn't go because her father famously said that no daughter of his would leave the house unless it was to be married. So that actually curtailed her from actually taking up that opportunity. But further to this, that was in 1906, but further to this in 1928, she was acknowledged by her own scientific peers when Calgren and Stephenson named a sea anemone after her. That's just some of her drawings there as well. And you can see that on the left-hand side there. And they actually named a whole genus after her, Edwardsia tilapia. In 1936, she was made an associate of the Linnaean Society in London, which was a key acknowledgement of her work. And publications of her and specimens of her work can be found in the National History Museum. And I would also recommend highly to you the exhibits in the local Valencia Museum, and Anita Guiney is with us this morning and probably be able to tell you much more about some of her work than I can. I think it's also important to say that just here on the right hand side, so the plaque in the middle actually I feel is the first national acknowledgement of her work, which was one of the first plaque I was involved in getting erected for women's sciences as part of that earlier WITS project, Women in Technology and Science project I mentioned to you. But her importance still actually is recorded today. On the right hand side here is the web page of a UK based project looking at important women in marine biology, and I absolutely love this. This is actually work on the website of the Spanish Institute for Oceanography, where on the right hand side here you can see there's little pictures of not just women but also of men who did important things in marine biology. And here we have Maud in the middle of them, and this is an international profile. And then if you go further in, you can see this lovely picture of Maud. A cartoon type picture, her surrounded by her jellyfish. I just think it's a beautiful, beautiful image of her surrounded by her jellyfish. So what I've outlined thus far, I'm moving on now from Maud just to talk about a couple of others before I finish up, because I'm just looking at my time here. Couple of others. So much of what I've talked about really in terms of science has been around the natural sciences, botany and zoology, those types of areas, which of course were for a time considered lesser sciences, but actually now with what's happening to our planet are actually re-emerging as really important sciences. But I do also want to mention another lady who was born in the area, Ada English, who became known as one of the revolutionary doctors. Because she was involved in the 1916 Rising in Galway. I think it was a bit of an accident that she was actually born here in Cahersiveen to Westmeath parents, because they very immediately afterwards took up residence in Mullingar. And I suppose the famous thing I want to really highlight about her, besides the fact that she was elected to the second Dáil in 1921, one of the 6 women that was elected at that time, she actually had a key role in revolutionising mental health treatments in St Bridget's Hospital in Ballinasloe, and she's seen now as having been a key driver introducing occupational therapy and therapies of that nature into the Irish system. She had spent some time in the UK. And just on the left there you can see a book by Brendan Kelly, UCD, about her biography. So to finish up just with just a couple of remarks, I suppose, moving forward into the 20th century. Women at this time began to emerge in all disciplines, but there were still challenges. On the left here, we have a picture of Aileen Cust from Roscommon. And she's a very critical example, because she, for example, graduated as the first female veterinary student from these islands in 1900 from Edinburgh. But it took up to 1922 for the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons to actually recognise her qualification. So I include her because it shows you that actually it took a while for things to actually change. And she became acknowledged, she's acknowledged now as the first female vet on these islands. On the right hand side there's a picture of Sheila Paratinney, who was born in Galway. And just to give you an example again, it was 1941 before she received the first PhD awarded to a woman in mathematical sciences, again interestingly from the University of Edinburgh. She was one of the first fellows selected to work with Erwin Schrödinger at my own institute, the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies, when it was set up. So she started there in 1943, went on to UCD, and then became one of the first 4 women elected to the Royal Irish Academy. We're nearly there. So at this time, things began to become much more professionalised. I include Cynthia Longfield here just to note her because she's from Cloyne, County Cork, because she actually is one of the very, very few exceptions that emerges at this time of someone who wasn't formally educated and who actually became a world-leading expert in dragonflies. In fact, became known as Madam Dragonfly, and there actually is a biography about her also. Again, a very interesting life, self-educated, etc. But she did come from upper, I suppose, a middle-class family. On the right-hand side here, I have included Carmel Humphreys because she exemplifies the fact that it was only really in the late 20th century that whilst women entered academia, the challenges became different for them. They could start then to engage in different subjects. They could actually get lectureships. The issue then became their progression, which is still an issue that is with us to this day and very much in the public domain today. I include Carmel Humphreys because she was the first woman professor of zoology on the island in UCD. And just again for note, she made very significant contributions to freshwater ecology research. And in fact, for the fishermen and men and women among you, she actually developed the system that is now used worldwide for classifying a particular type of midge, which I believe I'm told fishermen call duckflies, buzzards, or silver hawthorns. So you can see some of them here. So she made it, if you like, in Ireland. She was successful, became a professor in Ireland. But of course, as I mentioned earlier, some of the Irish women went abroad, and this is my last woman. And Kathleen Lonsdale is an example of an Irish woman who, in that period, went abroad. She was born in Newbridge. And while she's not from this area, I mention her because she actually probably is the best known Irish woman scientist internationally. She is the woman who became a chemist, went on through X-ray crystallography to discover that the benzene ring, if you remember back to your chemistry, is actually flat. And she was one of the first 2 women elected as a fellow of the Royal Society. And I'm delighted to say that, in fact, this was the second plaque that I was involved in erecting on the house that she was born in Newbridge. So to sum up, History has shown us that in spite of formidable obstacles, women across the area were motivated to become scientists and became good scientists. I have today focused on women on, I suppose, the bottom left-hand quadrant of the island of Ireland. And a lot of these women, whilst there are some plaques erected and that type of thing, they really have received scant national attention. All have received peer international recognition. So we've a bit of catching up to do nationally. Their achievements need to be brought out of the shadows and highlighted. And I would like that my presentation this morning would be considered as a call to action, if you like, to all of you nationally here and actually throughout the island to address those mission and to ensure that these women are included in our history stories going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eucharia. And yes, I think we can do our bit locally as well in terms of plaques and acknowledgement. And I, in my real life, I teach English and history, so there we can be adding to what we teach as we go as well. And I think it's also important to note that when you look at, like, one of the slogans that you hear today when you're trying to break down barriers is, if you don't see it, you can't be it. And these women were quite extraordinary, even beyond the norm, because they saw absolutely nothing, and yet they managed to overcome so much at the time. But what we need to do is obliterate all obstacles, be they socioeconomic, whatever comes in the way of education. It has to be taken away, because we are losing so much talent when we allow obstacles to remain. Our third speaker, Professor Yvonne Galligan, we're now welcome her to the mic, and we look forward to this contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Norma, for your very kind introduction. And thank you to Maurice and to the committee for the invitation and for your warm hospitality. It's very much appreciated. So I'm going to speak on broadening the public sphere, the impact of women. So I'm going to take a slightly different point of view, and certainly a different time scale to the previous speaker. So it's going to be a little bit of a gallop through the 20th century, basically. So let's begin. So here we have Senator Thomas Forne, who says in 1935, in section 16 of the Conditions of Employment Bill, he says, "I think the feminists have run riot. They have been extremely unreasonable in their criticism of the bill. I was in other countries and I saw women doing terrible physical work. I saw women in Sweden carrying deals, stoking ships, and acting as dock labourers. Do the feminists want that to come about in Holy Ireland?" There is much that one could say about his views and what they say about the status of women in the 1930s. For now, what is notable in his remarks is his reference to feminists and feminist pressure on public opinion. And so I'm going to try and track some of all of that over the next few minutes. We think of the period after suffrage as one where women's civil society participation and influence diminished. Not so. Women's activism continued to flourish in the post-independence and post-suffrage era, raising a wide range of women's rights issues. So, from the time of its foundation in 1935 up to its disbandment in 1993, the Joint Committee of Women's Societies and Social Workers drew together up to 14 women's organisations to campaign on many issues relating to the well-being of women and children. Its early concerns focused on a women's police force, an issue on which it campaigned with the National Council of Women and the Catholic Women's Federation. It challenged the laws limiting women's employment, hence Senator Forne's complaint. It had a continual interest in adoption matters. In 1981, it campaigned to remove lead from petrol, indeed ahead of its time. And in the 1990s, before it closed, it addressed the issues of surrogacy and in vitro fertilisation, childcare, and bullying in schools. So through the decades, it put a wide range of issues onto the public agenda. Another example is the Irish Housewives Association, which was founded on the 12th of May 1942 by 12 women, including Hilda Tweedy, Andre Sheehy Skeffington, and Susan Manning, who is the sister of the Irish Women Workers' Union leader Louis Bennett. They took as their task to investigate the living conditions among all sections of the community and to be the mouthpiece of the ordinary woman. It became the first consumer protection society in Ireland, held demonstrations for price controls on vegetables and potatoes, sought the pasteurisation of milk, the eradication of tuberculosis, and free school meals. And here is a picture of one of their demonstrations on free school meals. The Irish Housewives Association's lobbying on food safety led to the adoption of the food hygiene regulations in 1951 by the Minister for Health, Dr. Noel Brown. Their efforts contributed to the establishment of the Lower Prices Council in January 1947, with the aim of creating a national campaign for a drastic reduction in food and commodity prices. On the 7th of October 1947, this council held a women's parliament at the Catholic Commercial Club in Dublin, there in O'Connell Street. The parliament consisted of over 300 delegates representing 41 women's organisations who called for, among other things, an immediate reduction in the cost of living, the establishment of a prices tribunal to control the cost of food, and the creation of a fair rents tribunal to control the costs of housing. Indeed, some of those issues are still with us to this day. Sustained campaigning by the Irish Housewives Association, the Lower Prices Council, and labour groups began to impact on government. In response, the Minister for Industry and Commerce, Mr. Tom O'Higgins, established the Prices Advisory Council in 1951. The Irish Housewives Association, although campaigning on these very consumer-oriented issues, came under the view of the Archbishop of Dublin, John Charles McQuaid. And he asked his Vigilance Committee to investigate the IHA, which it did between 1954 and the 1960s, investigated it for communist activity. However, in her comprehensive study of the influence of the IHA, Aisling Farrell concludes that, and I quote her, by exercising their right to participate in a struggle that did not challenge the sexual division of labour, many of these women developed a strong sense of pride in their activities and a taste for political involvement. While they would not all necessarily come to think of themselves as feminists, they did nevertheless begin to conceive of themselves as a legitimate economic and political force, which could force the state to respond to their needs. The 1960s ushered in an era when women's demands pressed upon the public sphere in Ireland, with international developments also influencing domestic matters. In 1967, the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women mobilised national women's non-governmental organisations across the world to examine the status of women in their respective countries and urged them to lobby their government for a national commission. This call was heard by two organisations in Ireland with an international reach, the aforesaid Irish Housewives Association and the Association of Business and Professional Women's Clubs. They issued a joint call for a National Commission on the Status of Women to be established by the Irish government, and following from this call, established an ad hoc committee on women's rights, comprised of representatives from about a dozen active women's associations and trade union women. The Fianna Fáil government acquiesced to these lobbying efforts and established a commission on the status of women in 1970, chaired by the most senior female civil servant of the time, Dr. Thecla Beer. The 14-person commission of 7 women and 7 men, received submissions from 43 organisations, of which 18 were clearly identifiable as women's groups. These include the more established women's organisations, such as the Irish Country Women's Association and the Soroptimists, and included new arrivals on the scene, such as the Irish Women's Liberation Movement and the Women's Advisory Council of the Irish Labour Party. The report made 49 recommendations on removing discrimination against women in the areas of the home, employment, social welfare, taxation, family law, jury service, public life and education. So it was a very, very wide-ranging report. It also recognised that implementation of these recommendations was likely to be a lot more speedy if women's groups applied sustained pressure on the government of the day. This report was welcomed by politicians. Opening a debate on its contents in the Seanad, Senator Mary Robinson regarded it as, quote, the most important social document in recent Irish social history. Senator Kitty Hearn from Kerry also contributed to this debate. She welcomed the report, expressed concern as to the issue of economic inequality within marriage, and worried that women were not entering politics and contesting elections. Senator Michael Moynihan, also from Kerry, also welcomed it as a major blueprint for social change and linked it with the earlier important business of that day, which was the passing of legislation to remove the marriage bar in the public service. While many contributors dealt with themes relating to education, employment and the role of women in the home in a reflective manner in this debate, some of the welcome speeches were somewhat more colourful. Senator Michael Lyons, for example, sorry, I went ahead of myself, envisaged role reversal as follows. We must look at the situation as it will be in the future, he said. If the women themselves are to accept equality, they will no longer need the chivalrous male to support, protect, or open the door for them, or to wheel the pram for them. I didn't know chivalrous men did that at that time. They will, of their own right, defend themselves, and perhaps we may see the boot on the other foot. 2 decades on, when the Second Commission on the Status of Women reviewed progress on the implementation of this report, it found that of the 49 recommendations, only 3 still required significant attention: childcare, joint ownership of the family home, and women's participation in public decision making. 2 of those are still works in progress. Alongside this official agenda for change, the Irish Women's Liberation Movement manifesto, Chains or Change, contained 5 feminist demands: equal pay, equality before the law, equal education, contraception, and justice for deserted wives, unmarried mothers and widows. A 6th demand, housing for all, reflected the radical socialist agenda of some feminists in the movement. The women's liberation movement attracted media attention through its direct action protests, such as we see here. This is a photograph of the contraception train returning from Belfast. And it generated a lively public debate on the effects of laws that kept women subservient in Ireland. Although the women's liberation movement split over tensions on tactics, ideology, including the issue of the Northern Ireland question, and personalities, its legacy was a host of single-issue campaigns that pushed forward reforms on the status of women. In parallel to all of these events, the ad hoc women's group that lobbied for the Commission on the Status of Women report reformed as the Council for the Status of Women, today known as the National Women's Council of Ireland. It was recognised by government in 1979 as the official spokesbody of women's organisations. By 1987, it had 45 affiliated group members, and today it represents over 180 women's groups. Its campaigns include today ending sexual violence and harassment on university campuses, free contraception, and paid parental leave. But back to the 1970s. To monitor the implementation of the Commission report, the Women's Representative Committee was established by Minister Michael O'Leary in 1974. This body was superseded in 1977 when the Employment Equality Agency came into being as a consequence of equal opportunities directives emanating from the then European Economic Community. Thus, by the end of the 1970s, there existed a mix of voluntary, statutory and semi-professional groups and agencies focused on addressing the many economic, social, legal and political discriminations against women. By 1980, many of the more egregious impediments to equality were removed. The marriage bar, which I mentioned, was repealed in 1973. Pay equality and equal opportunities in employment introduced by 1977. Contraception was legalised in a highly limited form in 1980, and the tax code was reformed to remove discrimination against working wives. In December 1982, the Fine Gael Labour government created the first Ministry of Women's Affairs at the Department of the Taoiseach. The post was held by Nuala Fennell, who had previously been a member of the Women's Liberation Movement and founder of Women's Aid and campaigner for services for women and children suffering domestic violence. During her period in office, Fennell introduced a number of fundamental reforms of family law, such as the laws on domicile, the status of children, and citizenship. In 1985, Fennell, on behalf of Ireland, signed and ratified the United Nations Convention on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. In 1985 also, under Fennell's guidance, a framework for women's rights was published, covering key areas such as employment, education, health, social welfare and enterprise, against which government progress was measured. This was the first national strategy for gender equality. In the 1990s in Northern Ireland, women made critical interventions in the unfolding peace process. The story of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition is one of women wanting to shape the peace arrangements that would define the public sphere in their part of Ireland. Initially, with 2 members at the Forum for Peace and Reconciliation, and later with 2 representatives at the Mitchell-chaired peace talks, the Women's Coalition brought their principles of equality, human rights and inclusion to these difficult discussions. An enduring outcome of their engagement is the continued commitment by the Irish government to supporting the women, peace and security agenda in Ireland, as well as in a global context. And that is quite a diplomatic challenge. Despite the 2 decades of public engagement finding some settlement on the totemic issues of divorce, abortion and marriage equality, there are issues that the public sphere has yet to properly address. There is an attachment to women's status as homemakers deeply embedded in Irish culture. Back in 1993, the Second Commission on the Status of Women recommended that Article 41(2) on women in the home be removed from the Constitution, a point that went unheeded by the government at the time. In 1996, the Constitutional Review Group, established by government to advise on constitutional reform, recommended that the article be amended to a more gender-neutral form that recognised the societal value of care work. Again, that matter was ignored. The National Women's Council and the Constitutional Convention arrived at a similar conclusion in 2013 with respect to reforming this article. Since the turn of the millennium, the Irish government has come under international pressure to amend or delete this article from the Constitution. The United Nations Commission on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women expressed concern in 2005 that Article 41(2) perpetuated traditional gender stereotypes. In 2017, that same commission reiterated its concern that this provision had not been constitutionally amended. 1 year later, in 2018, last year, the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission advised that Article 41(2) be amended to become gender neutral, to recognise family life as an all-embracing concept and include care work as part of the work undertaken in the home. On July the 5th, 2018, the Cabinet resolved to hold a referendum on deleting Article 41(2) from the Constitution, following a consultation with the National Women's Council and the Parliamentary Women's Caucus. The vote was provisionally scheduled to take place in conjunction with the 2018 presidential election. However, after public unease at a simple deletion of the provision, the Minister for Justice, Charles Flanagan, postponed setting the referendum date to facilitate pre-legislative scrutiny and debate on the issue. At a pre-legislative scrutiny meeting held by the Justice and Equality Committee, diverse views were expressed by human rights, women's and legal experts. The upcoming Citizens' Assembly on Gender Equality, announced by the government on the 9th of June, just gone, will offer an opportunity to tease out this issue as it tasks 100 citizens to examine women's and men's co-responsibility for care. So in conclusion, a century of public action, debate and reform by individual women and women's organisations has embedded the personal in the public and political sphere. Law and policy have been reformed to remove many discriminations against women. International agendas, such as the UN Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the Security Council Resolution on Women, Peace and Security, and the UN Sustainable Development Goals provide an international framework within which the role and status of women in Irish society can be interpreted and addressed in a manner relevant to the times. The age-old question of division of labour in the home, the bedrock of gender inequality and the foundation of gender role stereotyping, is about to become a matter of full debate. There are related issues bubbling to the surface that speak to the legacy of discrimination against women, such as, for example, the impoverishment of women in their older years because they carried the care work without pension provision. How we complete the integration of women on a par with men into all aspects of the economy, of society and the public sphere is unfinished business. And how, together, we shape and structure the fourth industrial revolution is an emerging challenge. Unlike Senator Horne, I think we need more, not fewer, feminists, women and men, to run riot, to challenge the status quo, and to be the disruptors of today.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. We now have an opportunity to open it up to the floor. We have a roving mic, one or two. So if there's anybody with any questions or any comments. We have a hand up, that's great.
They're on, yeah. Pass that one to the stage. Thanks very much.
You might raise your hand again, sir, if you don't mind, please. Thank you. We get a mic to you.
Good morning. I wanted to ask Dr. McAuliffe, without wanting to call the role of women in the War of Independence into question in general, I wondered how wary does one have to be in writing history on the basis of some of your sources anyway. I think in particular the pension archives, where people are after all recommending themselves or their friends for pensions. The prospect of a generous pension might well retrospectively inform the extent to which one's mother's nerves were affected by your or her experience with black and tans, for example. There are presumably some cases where there's an element of falsification. The problem is finding them, and they might be found maybe among rejected applications by people who were maybe a bit more in the know, but perhaps it's a problem that they'll also perhaps have been made.
Yes. Well, I wouldn't call the pensions that most women got generous anyway. So yes, of course, obviously with any source you have to measure them against other sources, and you have to question the sources. However, with the military pension applications, there was the need for several references. And you do see people saying, I have no knowledge of who this woman was, I never saw her in my life, I don't know, and then somebody else would say she was very important to the cause. So yeah, you don't use just one source to look at what the women did. You also measure it against other sources and obviously come to do an analysis of it and come to your own conclusions on that. But in general, the military pensions are in many ways closer to the activities, say, than the Bureau of Military History, because of course people are applying from the 1920s firstly, although they're mostly pro-treaty men. Women. Only 2 women applied in the 1920s, and one of them, Margaret Skinner, even though she had 3 wounds, was refused because she was an infamous irregular. She was actually at that Women's Parliament in 1947 as a member of the INTO. But I think we can look at the military pensions as fairly solid material. I don't think there was too much cheating on it. But yes, we haven't seen I think 18,000 pensions were granted and upwards of 60,000 people applied. So the standard was quite high to get a pension. And more people were denied pensions than actually got them. And indeed, a lot of women were denied pensions because they couldn't prove what they did. And what they did then wasn't seen as valid to the conduct of war. The whole idea of the status of the combatant, who gets to be a combatant, is very gendered. And a lot of the times the women were refused those pensions. But yes, you always have to question the sources. So you measure them against other sources and you look for other material that also back up what they're saying in their pensions files.
Very good. Thank you, Mary. Have we another question? We have somebody with a rubber mic ready to pounce. Very good.
Actually, it's not really a question. I think it's more an observation in view of the different points that you've all made this morning. The treatment of women during the War of Independence and after that, and the role that they had in trying to push forward various social issues. Was the War of Independence and the Republican movement a socialist movement? What was the politics and ideology of the Republican movement apart from just independence? Is that sort of irrelevant?
Well, have you got a whole day?
Exactly.
It was very mixed, yeah. I mean, for the women themselves in the Republican movement, their touchstone was the Proclamation of Independence, 1916, in which there is a promise of full equality in the 32-county republic that was going to come into being as they imagined after the War of Independence. But you also have to see these men and women as products of their time, and particularly for the men. And in doing my research on sexual violence, it's not just the black and tans that are, and gendered violence that are attacking women at this time. You also have the IRA making attacks on women who are seen to be company keeping. So you see elements of what will become that sort of moral policing that happens in the Irish Free State very early on, as was pointed out in your talk. From very early on, the Irish Free State positions women as second-class citizens. And they are the Republicans who had become then the political masters, the ones who were pro-treaty. So the ideology is interesting. But also, if you unpack it even more, for what women were seeing themselves as equal, an awful lot of the women didn't have any problem with incarcerating other women who had seemed to have committed or gone against moral codes of the day in Magdalene laundries and mother and baby homes. Those women weren't regarded as part of the new state. They would always continue to be marginalised or disregarded persons as well. So it's very, very complicated. You can't say that the Republican movement, or indeed the socialist movement, because James Connolly was very upset when a young woman was put into the Hyde Park Magdalene laundry after she was arrested in 1913 on the strike line during the lockout. And there was a big campaign to get her out, not because she was imprisoned, but because she could be morally compromised by her association with these women in the Hyde Park Magdalene laundry. So, you know, it's a very nuanced, a very complicated question, to which the answers are very, very long and complicated and complex as well.
Do we have another question? I think we've time for one or two more questions before we... Sean O'Horgan, at the back there. We'll get a mic to you, Sean. Although you're kind of used to speaking without one anyway.
Thanks, Norma. Just a question for you, Kerry, I suppose, and it's related to the broader issues in terms of education. How big an impact was there of the attacks on the big houses and the obvious social division between Catholics and Protestants on the fact that maybe we didn't develop in the way that Irish women didn't develop in the way that they would have been expected to in terms of their impact on the sciences, and how was that related to the issues around the War of Independence, and the fact that many of those, I suppose, community left Ireland and went abroad for their education. And I suppose just on one woman's name sprung to my own mind when we were speaking about the social changes in the 70s and 80s, and one of many. But it's extraordinary that there was no senior woman minister appointed between Countess Markiewicz and Eileen Desmond, who served as MEP for this area, and Maura Geoghegan-Quinn shortly before her in the space of 70 or 80 years. But I certainly think that Eileen Desmond's role as Minister for Social Welfare and organisations like the National Campaign for Welfare Reform should be included in I think what's a very proud legacy.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, I think it's true to say, even in a couple of the examples that I gave, where I showed, for example, that Eileen Cust could go to Edinburgh and get a degree in veterinary, or the fact that Sheila Parr-Tinney actually was accepted to do a PhD in Edinburgh, even in the late 1930s, shows, and there are other examples, that actually in terms of really the acceptance of women in the sciences and as being, I suppose, valued contributors to the sciences, and the acceptance that in fact not just that they could study science, but in fact that they could have careers in science, Ireland was a lot slower, I suppose, at coming to that realisation than our neighbouring island. And I think, going back to the previous answer, I think there's quite complex reasons for that. A lot of it being grounded in, again, the social norms, the expectations, and the view of what the role of women were at that point in time. They've been looked at in that gendered way, where their role was seen as somehow as being secondary, and of course the fact that it was not considered important that they be educated in the same way as their male counterparts, right up to the end of even the right into the 1900s, means that actually that really wasn't focused on. And of course the fact that I cannot say whether there was an element of the fact that I suppose some of this activity was seen as being the privilege of, I suppose, the comfortable classes who in the main at that stage were Protestant, maybe from particular political persuasions. I can't definitively say that that was a factor. I don't have the evidence before me for that. But there's no doubt that the fact that I suppose, because we were involved, I suppose, in a kind of a national struggle, a bigger picture struggle, a lot of the focus and the attention nationally really was obviously around that. So it's complicated in terms of the education dimension, also in terms of, I suppose, the social and religious dimensions, and then in terms just of where women were seen in the overall picture at that point in time. So it took us a long time to catch up.
Yeah, I think my comment on all of this, following on what Eucharia says, is that I think we have to not assume that everything is settled today.
Yeah, that's true.
And I think that we have to be very concerned that there is still a lot of stereotyping in terms of what are perceived as suitable subjects for girls and suitable subjects for boys. This is, in my view, a really critical issue that we have never really grappled with and really need to grapple with in our society as well as in our Department of Education and in our educational curriculum as a whole. It's not just about education, it's about the messages that we send as societies, as communities, to our girls and our boys as they are growing up. And increasingly, our girls and our boys are becoming much more diverse in their backgrounds, diverse in their orientations, diverse in the ways they understand the world. And we need also to begin to reflect that as well. And so I think the challenges that we have laid out before all of us today that relate to the past have their legacies in the present. And I think we need to look at them with our eyes of the present and tackle them for the present and the future.
I think that is actually a wonderful note to finish on, to be perfectly honest with you, because you have set us all a task, and indeed we should accept the challenge. But before we take it up, we might have a cup of tea. So I'm going to hand you back to Maurice.
Just to remind you, the tea is served next door, tea and coffee in the room next door. We will resume at 12 noon again, but in the meantime, as I said, coffee in the room next door. And we'll open some windows during the break as well.